Have you ever kept a family secret for decades? I won't ask what, just curious.
When my parents handed my brother the keys to his new house, I actually clapped. It wasn't sarcasm, not at first. I was genuinely proud, maybe even relieved. I thought that finally, after all these years of bailing him out, of watching him drift from one impulsive disaster to the next, he had done something worth celebrating. The backyard was strung with lights, champagne glasses were already sweating in the July heat, and my mother's eyes shimmered with tears as she said, "He's been through so much. He deserves this." And I, like an idiot, nodded along, pretending I didn't know exactly what "been through so much" really meant. Evan, my older brother by 2 years, was the kind of person you couldn't stay mad at because he never stayed long enough for the consequences to stick. In high school, he was charming and wild, the guy who could crash a borrowed car on a Friday night and somehow make you believe it was the car's fault. I used to envy him for how easily he shrugged off everything: responsibility, guilt, logic. Meanwhile, I was the kid balancing my checkbook at 17, applying for scholarships while he was selling his textbooks for beer money. Our lives ran parallel for a while until adulthood forced a choice. I built stability, he built excuses. When they said they were giving him the house, I assumed they meant they were helping with a down payment or co-signing a mortgage, something normal, something that suggested he was at least participating in his own life. But when my father raised his glass and said, "To our son, finally having a home of his own and debt-free too," I felt something in my chest twist so sharply it almost made me laugh. Debt-free. The word echoed like a joke told in a language I no longer spoke. My mother squeezed my shoulder, smiling in that way mothers do when they think they've just delivered good news, and said, "You're so good with finances, honey. You'll help him keep up, right? You've always been our responsible one." It was one of those moments where time slows down just enough for you to see how ridiculous everything truly is. The heat, the laughter, the sound of the champagne cork hitting the patio stones, all of it blurred together, while my brain quietly processed the fact that my parents had just gifted my brother a fully paid-off house, then immediately volunteered me as his financial babysitter. I wanted to ask if they'd lost their minds, but instead I just smiled, raised my glass, and said, "Of course." Because that's what you do when you've been cast as the reliable one in a family that rewards chaos. Later that night, after everyone had gone home and the fairy lights were still flickering across the lawn, I sat on the edge of the deck and watched my brother through the window of his new living room. He was already talking about knocking out a wall and getting a big screen for the Super Bowl, while my parents nodded proudly like they'd just secured world peace. I remembered the tiny apartment I'd rented after college, the peeling paint, the mattress I'd bought secondhand, the way I'd celebrated paying off my first student loan with a cheap bottle of wine and takeout sushi. No one had thrown me a barbecue. No one had handed me keys. When I left that night, my father hugged me and said, "You know, family helps family. We just need everyone to pitch in a bit." Pitch in. That was their phrase. It had followed me my whole life, from buying my brother new tires when he forgot to save money, to covering his insurance so he wouldn't lose his license. I had always pitched in. It had never occurred to them that maybe I was tired. That maybe my life, the one they took for granted because it ran smoothly, wasn't effortless at all. In the weeks that followed, I tried to convince myself that I was overreacting, that maybe this was their way of finally giving Evan a fresh start. But the calls started almost immediately. First, my mom, "Honey, he's a little short on the utilities. Can you help out this month?" Then my dad, "You make more than he does, and you don't have kids, so it's just temporary." I'd hang up, stare at the wall, and feel that dull pressure behind my eyes that comes from swallowing anger too many times. By the third week, I got a text from my brother himself. "Hey sis, you're good with money, can you look over my mortgage paperwork? I think I signed something weird." That was the moment I realized there was no bottom to this. They hadn't given him a gift, they'd handed me another responsibility disguised as one. I spent that night going through my own bills, my savings, my modest little life, and for the first time, I felt a strange kind of stillness. Not sadness, not rage, just the awareness that something inside me had shifted. I started replaying every conversation in my head, the the times they called me the practical one, the mature one, the one who always helps. It wasn't praise, it was conditioning. I was the safety net that made their poor decisions survivable. And now they'd extended that role to a literal mortgage. That night, I opened my laptop, created a blank spreadsheet, and typed one line at the top, family expenses, to be repaid never. It might sound petty, but that was the first time I allowed myself to track the imbalance, not just in money, but in energy, in expectations, in respect. I listed every favor, every loan, every just this once, and the total felt heavier than any debt collector's ledger could measure. When I closed the file, I didn't feel better, but I did feel awake. And as I stared at the blinking cursor, I promised myself one thing: the next time they came asking for help, I wouldn't say no. Not directly. I'd simply start keeping score. Because sometimes, the only way to stop being the responsible one is to start acting like you finally understand what responsibility really costs. By the time the confetti-worthy glow of the backyard celebration faded and the paper lanterns had gone limp on their strings, the real arithmetic of our family's generosity began to surface in the way it always did. Not as a single dramatic invoice, but as a steady drizzle of obligations dressed up as love. And while my mother spoke about fresh starts and my father floated that favorite phrase of his about everyone pitching in, I found myself taking a slow inventory of the history that made this new house less a miracle than a continuation of a pattern I had helped cement with my dependable wallet and my quiet tolerance. I remembered the winter when my brother forgot to renew his insurance and spun a borrowed car into a guardrail on a slushy ramp, and how the call came to me because I handled stress well, which apparently meant I could sit in a fluorescent office at 2 in the morning signing papers that were not mine so a tow yard would release a vehicle that was not mine, smiling at a clerk who said I was a good sister, as if that compliment could be exchanged later for a rent discount or a thicker blanket of respect. I remembered the spring when a landlord sent a notice written in blocky capital letters that might as well have been a siren, and how I covered the arrears while my brother told a long story about a roommate fleeing with the money. A story as polished as Riverstone and just as slippery, and how my parents thanked me with that soft tone reserved for acts that make them proud without ever prompting them to change their behavior. It would be neat to say that those memories hardened me instantly, but I have always been susceptible to the promise that next time will be different if we just make it through this one last crisis, a weakness I prefer to call hope because it sounds less pathetic, and because rebranding has its uses when you are trying to live with decisions that don't flatter you. Still, something in me had shifted after the house keys clicked into my brother's palm, so when the first, temporary, ask arrived in my mother's lilting voice, I took a breath that tasted like pennies and told her I would be happy to help if she could send the request by email with the purpose stated in clear words, the amount spelled out like a check, and a plan for repayment that included dates, since dates have a way of making fantasies behave. She paused long enough for me to imagine her face rearranging itself into disbelief, then said she would call me back, which she did not, and by evening my father had taken up the baton with a speech about family not needing paperwork, to which I replied that I was adopting a new family policy and would even create a simple form to make it easier on everyone. And I could hear the scrape of his patience like a chair being pushed back from the table. The form, when I sent it, was cheerful and absurd on purpose, a tidy little survey that asked for the story behind the request, the amount in words, the collateral offered if any, and a section labeled "What we learned from last time," with a drop-down that included options like "Do not hand houseplants to people who forget to water," "Set calendar reminders for bills," and "Say no without apologizing," and "Because transparency is the cousin of accountability." I copied my parents on the same family thread where we share photographs of birthdays and dog costumes, not to embarrass them, though that was a side effect I did not mind, but because secret arrangements breed entitlement while visible rules, even silly ones, breed caution. My brother replied with a single line, something about me being dramatic, which I ignored, and my mother called to say I was making things complicated, because in our family simplicity means I pay and everyone else says thank you. The truth is that revenge rarely arrives as a grand gesture with violins and confessions, More often it begins as a new boundary enforced with the politeness of a receptionist and the persistence of a metronome. So while I waited for the next request to arrive in its proper form, I spent an evening performing an audit of a different kind, freezing my credit with the 3 bureaus whose names I once recalled only in moments of panic, setting fraud alerts that chirped like small alarms in a sleeping house, and creating a separate email address with a rule that funneled anything tagged urgent into a folder named expected, because I am done being surprised by predictable behavior. I distilled a list of simple statements that I knew I would forget in the heat of a phone call, sentences such as "I am not available for that," "I cannot do that," and "that does not work for me," and taped them by my laptop so that when the pleading began, I could read them out in a voice that sounded almost calm. A small script for a part 1 had been misplaying for years. When my aunt, who has a nose for household weather, called to ask whether everything was all right because the group thread had suddenly gone quiet, I told her the truth in a clean sentence that tasted like fresh water. That I was no longer subsidizing bad decisions dressed as emergencies, and she inhaled sharply and then laughed the way people laugh when someone finally says the thing everyone has been dancing around, and she told me to keep a copy of every message. Not because I would need ammunition, but because I would need reminders that I had not imagined any of it. I went to sleep with the kind of rest you get not from peace, but from a plan, and woke to a day that felt ordinary in the way victory often does when it is mostly administrative. The next request did arrive, but not as a tidy form submission or even a sheepish text. It came as a photograph my brother posted of a massive television glowing in his new living room with the caption about leveling up. And beneath it my mother's heart emojis and my father's thumbs up, and buried a few comments down a small note from a delivery service thanking the account holder for the purchase and confirming the card ending in digits that brushed against recognition with a cat's tail. Softness, and for a long breath I stared at the screen and told myself the similarity was a coincidence, that plenty of cards share those particular endings, that paranoia is just a hobby for the overworked. I made coffee strong enough to stand a spoon in, opened my email to distract myself with actual work, and found, sitting like a stone in a river, a notification from a bank I had not used in years, a bland subject line about an update to my profile, a request to confirm a new address I had not listed, and underneath that another message with the word co-applicant, threaded through it like a splinter you cannot quite pull. And while my phone began to ring with my mother's name blooming across the screen, the doorbell sounded in that same instant. And there on the mat lay a padded envelope stamped with certified stickers, the edges crimped like it had been handled too many times, and I knew before I opened it that whatever was inside carried my name into a place it did not belong. The certified envelope contained a tone-deaf welcome packet and a thin stack of forms that pretended to be routine, but the letter on top, with its polite language about my successful addition as co-applicant to a home improvement line linked to my brother's address, carried the kind of quiet violence only paperwork can deliver, and as I studied the cheap photocopy of a signature that tried to pass for mine, loops swollen like damp rope, letters leaning as if they had been poured rather than written, I felt the first cold layer of anger settle into something deliberate, something that would not flare and vanish, but would instead hold a steady temperature as I did what I have always done best, which is to document, to escalate, and to refuse to be the kind of helpful that keeps other people childish. I did what the brochures never picture. I brewed coffee strong enough to make my eyelids vibrate, laid out my driver's license and the documents that actually belonged to me, photographed the alleged signature from 3 angles with the timestamp visible, and then, because I have learned that institutions respond to choreography as much as to content, I wrote a short sworn statement, printed it, and took it to a notary who raised an eyebrow when I explained that I was certifying an absence rather than a presence, not that I had signed, but that I had not, which somehow felt truer to the problem at hand than any flourish of ink could ever convey. By midday I had spoken, without losing my temper, to 3 separate fraud departments, each with its own script and its own hold music pretending everything would be fine. I requested an identity theft block under the law that exists precisely for days like this, filed the police report that gives a case number rather than comfort, and assembled a packet so tidy it could have taught a class, with copies of the forged application, my affidavit, the notary seal, and a brief letter in the kind of calm tone I reserve for emails that need to be read by people who would prefer to nap. And I sent the whole thing both electronically and by certified mail because I wanted signatures and scanning codes and a paper trail that could be followed later like breadcrumbs dropped for future me. I froze my credit last week, so the scope of damage was contained, but containment is not the same as reversal, and while I dislike drama, I have no objection to consequences, so when the merchant's fraud desk asked whether any items had been delivered on this account, I supplied the order number, helpfully displayed on my brother's social post, the one with the glowing television like a billboard for bad judgment. And I watched the silence extend while the agent clicked through screens I could not see, a pause that ended with her professional voice saying that, pending verification of my report, the order would be placed on hold and a return scheduled, and if I wished, a flag could be added that would require in-person ID checks for any pickup or delivery tied to the address in question. It would be satisfying to pretend I hesitated, but I did not, because the line between revenge and restoration is thin and, in this case, aligned with policy, so I asked that the hold be placed and the return be scheduled. And then I typed a note to myself that clarity is not cruelty even when it looks like a delivery truck pulling away from a driveway while a man stands in socks on his new porch shouting at a stranger who is only doing her job. To keep my hands steady, I turned to the practical next step, which was to communicate nothing of this to my parents, who have a talent for converting facts into pleas, and instead to send my brother a message that sounded as if I were reluctantly cooperating, an almost cheerful text suggesting that, if he wanted my help keeping the accounts straight, he should forward me, in one email, all the applications he had filed and any drafts he had accidentally submitted using my name because banks are picky and I needed to see the exact wording. Or else I would be no use at all, and I will admit I took a small, mean pleasure in how quickly he complied, pulling together a neat bundle of screenshots and half-finished forms with just enough carelessness to be useful, including one image where the cursor blinked inside the field labeled Co-Applicant Email, a field containing mine. I forwarded that trove to my folder labeled with his name, then to the attorney I had found 2 days ago when my hunch about the envelope began to press against my skin like weather. A woman whose voice carries the patience of someone who has watched many families confuse love with access, and she replied in minutes with a list of next moves that felt like a staircase being lowered in front of me, each step plain and close enough to reach, beginning with a demand letter to the lender that would not only block any use of my name, but would also request the IP logs and application timestamps that, when paired with my location data and work calendar, could make a clean little picture for anyone who needed such things spelled out. She suggested, too, a small preventive grace note I would never have considered, a postal forwarding hold, and a fraud watch with the delivery company, measures that would not stop every foolish attempt, but would at least make the friction visible to the people causing it, and although I am not a vindictive person by nature, I signed the forms with a steadiness that felt close to relief. The first visible consequence arrived faster than I had expected, which is to say it landed at exactly the speed of a truck whose dispatcher has just been told to retrieve a high-value item tied to a fraud file, and I would be lying if I said I did not stand 2 streets over and watch what happened at the house my parents like to call a blessing. A worker in a reflective vest spoke into a phone, glanced at his tablet, and rolled the oversized box back down the path while my brother, barefoot, hair wild, a game paused on the screen inside, tried to explain that there had been a misunderstanding, and I imagine there had been, only not the kind he meant. I did not wave. I do not need scenes to feel victorious. But when my mother phoned an hour later with a softness in her voice that used to make me weaker, asking whether I knew anything about a mix-up with the television, I said, with a calm I had earned, that the lender had flagged a fraudulent co-applicant, and that, going forward, anything bearing my name without my consent would travel back to sender as predictably as a ball thrown at a wall. Then I suggested we move all requests into email for clarity because emotions were running high, and I let the silence that followed do the work that, for once, I did not have to do. The day might have ended quietly there, but revenge has a way of multiplying once you stop feeding it shame, so before I shut my laptop, I filed a modest complaint with the Homeowners Association about unauthorized deliveries blocking the sidewalk, attached, helpfully, to my brother's public post that showed the box perched like a monument, because if I am being drafted as an extra in the theater of his adulthood, I am at least going to choose my lines, and the notice they issued later that evening, with its crisp reminder about fines and repeat violations, felt like a small, almost petty justice that nevertheless tasted better than any apology could. I slept hard for the first time in weeks, and when morning came, a new message waited on my screen, a terse note from the lender's fraud unit requesting a brief phone call to confirm details, and, in the same minute, a text from my brother that was less a question than a howl, asking why I was sabotaging the house, and I stared at both until my heartbeat leveled, then answered neither, because my appointment at the attorney's office was in 2 hours, and if he wanted answers, he could bring them to the table himself, preferably in writing, preferably under oath. By the time I reached the quiet of my apartment late that evening, the weight of the forged signature and the encroaching obligations pressed on me with a gravity that was almost physical, and I realized that everything I had endured over the years, from small debts and unpaid favors to endless explanations and guilt-laden phone calls, had prepared me for this precise moment when I could finally turn observation into action without the interference of emotion or pleading, and as I sat at my desk surrounded by bills and account statements, I began what I came to call the silent audit, a meticulous compilation of every instance in which my time, money, and patience had been extracted from me under the guise of family love. A ledger that included dates, amounts, excuses, and the subtle manipulations that always accompanied my parents' requests, all of it forming a picture so clear it could not be denied, and as I typed, the details came back in vivid relief. The promises to repay, the emergency calls in the middle of the night, the abandoned accounts, the bills that magically appeared in my name, and the silent understanding that none of this had been accidental, but rather the predictable outcome of their belief that I existed to provide stability while Evan existed to be loved. I reached out quietly to an attorney I had discovered through careful research, someone who had experience with fraud and family disputes, and after explaining the situation without embellishment, she outlined a path that transformed what felt like chaos into a series of steps I could take with precision, each designed to expose the misuse of my identity, protect me legally, and give me leverage over a brother and parents who had assumed they could act with impunity. And as I began gathering emails, text messages, photographs, and mortgage statements, the process became almost meditative, a careful, deliberate choreography that ensured every detail was documented and every lie could be matched with evidence. And as the night deepened, I realized that for the first time I was moving from reaction to strategy, from anger to control, and the shift gave me a sense of power that was both exhilarating and necessary. The next morning, I began contacting institutions, starting with the bank, presenting the documentation of the forged signature, and requested immediate protective measures including identity verification holds, fraud flags, and alerts on any transactions related to my name. And while I spoke with agents who treated my calm insistence as professional competence, I could hear the strain in their voices as they processed the discrepancies, and I imagined my brother, still oblivious, celebrating some imagined triumph in his living room, unaware that every action he had taken with my name attached was now under scrutiny, and that the same house that had been handed to him without effort was slowly becoming a theater of accountability orchestrated by the one person they had assumed would always absorb the cost of his mistakes. I communicated nothing to my parents during this phase, aware that knowledge of my actions would have allowed them to manipulate, persuade, or guilt me into rescinding the steps I had taken, and instead, I sent carefully neutral texts to my brother, pretending to cooperate while forwarding every document, screenshot, and form to my attorney, creating a repository that would serve both as evidence and as a quiet reminder that I had stopped participating in the illusion of his independence. And while I maintained the outward appearance of compliance, Inside, I was mapping out contingencies, imagining how each institution would respond, how delays would frustrate him, and how the legal system, when applied with precision, could enforce consequences that my parents and brother had never considered, consequences that would not require dramatics or confrontation, but would nonetheless deliver clarity and justice. As the week unfolded, the first visible results of the audit appeared in subtle, almost bureaucratic ways: notices from the bank flagged with bold headings, delivery holds placed on items ordered under my name, and automated messages informing my brother that verification was required for any transaction. And although these were administrative actions, the psychological effect was immediate. Evan's casual confidence faltered in small but measurable ways. His posts became more hesitant, and his requests to me, always couched in humor or affection, were suddenly routed through channels that forced accountability, which was a taste of reality he had rarely experienced. And I found satisfaction not in humiliation, but in the restoration of balance, the sense that fairness could be enforced quietly, without confrontation or public spectacle, a principle I had rarely been allowed to exercise. By the end of the week, I reflected on the audit not as revenge in the melodramatic sense, but as a consolidation of control and clarity. A demonstration that the measures one takes when empowered by knowledge and documentation can shift dynamics long assumed unchangeable. And as I prepared my attorney's next set of instructions for formal correspondence with the bank and other institutions, I understood that the most effective action often comes not from shouting, pleading, or dramatics, but from precision, planning, and patience. And while the family remained blissfully unaware of the quiet forces at work, I was ready for the next phase, confident that the house, the debts, and the expectations that had been unfairly placed on me would be met with an exactness they could neither ignore nor evade, and that for the first time, I would dictate the terms of engagement in a family dynamic that had long taken me for granted. The day I had been planning quietly for weeks arrived with the sort of inevitability that comes only after meticulous preparation, and I walked into the room with a calmness that belied the storm of calculations, evidence, and contingency plans I had carried for years, knowing that every piece of paper in my folder represented not just financial documentation, but the story of a lifetime spent absorbing responsibility, while my parents and my brother acted as if consequences belonged only to other people. And when I laid out the evidence before them, copies of mortgage statements, screenshots of online orders, text messages that chronicled promises and excuses, and the forged signature that had catalyzed this entire operation, the faces around the table shifted from smug satisfaction to a mix of disbelief, confusion, and, for a brief moment, fear, as the reality that their assumptions about my compliance were not only flawed but dangerously naive began to settle in. I started with the ledger I had compiled over months, detailing every loan, every unpaid utility, every emergency I had silently covered, presenting it not as a lecture, but as a sequence of facts organized with a clarity that no plea, guilt trip, or excuse could obscure. And as I spoke, the room grew silent except for the faint hum of the air conditioner and the occasional shuffling of papers, while my parents' eyes flicked nervously from document to document, realizing that the narrative of the responsible daughter they had relied upon for years was now being wielded with intention, and my brother, who had long treated my cooperation as inevitable, shifted in his chair, suddenly aware that the indulgence they had granted him was, in fact, under scrutiny he had not anticipated. When I reached the part about the house, I allowed a slight pause, long enough to let the weight of the claim settle on them, then calmly explained that the house had been transferred to a neutral holding account to prevent further misuse, that the bank had been notified of the unauthorized co-applicant information, and that any additional expenditure or transaction under my name would be blocked automatically, legally, and irrevocably. And as the silence stretched, I could feel the tension in the room compressing the air, their mouths opening to speak, but closing again because words were inadequate against the meticulous chain of evidence and the quiet assertion of authority I embodied, authority that did not need to be raised in volume to carry power. The reactions were immediate and subtle, but unmistakable ways. My father's jaw tightened, a muscle twitching almost imperceptibly as he considered the implications for his favorite narrative that I would always accommodate every lapse in judgment. My mother's hands pressed together, knuckles white, eyes flicking between the documents, and my face in a way that suggested a frantic calculation of how to reclaim control over a situation that had always seemed trivial until now, and my brother's gaze darted around the table, searching for a loophole, a miracle, or a last-minute indulgence, all of which I had anticipated and preemptively nullified, leaving him suspended in a realization that accountability could, in fact, arrive without drama but with precision. I did not shout, I did not cry, and I did not threaten. Instead, I laid out a timeline for resolution, providing a clear plan for the return of misused funds, restitution for unauthorized expenses, and a framework for how future actions involving my name or finances would be handled legally and transparently, and I watched as the room absorbed the message. The weight of my preparation transforming the air from familiar comfort to uncomfortable clarity, as each family member understood, finally, that the infrastructure of my patience had limits, that it had been respected too little for too long, and that the rules of engagement were now mine to define. When the meeting ended, I left without raising my voice, without needing to insist on my presence as a witness, and while the house remained physically with my brother, the reality had shifted irreversibly. The financial autonomy they had assumed he enjoyed was now constrained by law and evidence, and the illusion of my infinite compliance had been replaced by a framework of consequence that was deliberate, undeniable, and, for once, entirely controlled by me. And as I walked out, the soft click of the front door behind me sounded almost ceremonial, marking the conclusion of an era in which I had absorbed responsibility without question, and the beginning of one in which boundaries were enforced, precision replaced assumption, and silent authority became the mechanism of justice I had cultivated through patience, observation, and unwavering attention to detail. In the days that followed, the social circles that my parents frequented began to receive notices, inquiries, and formal communications that spread the news in a way that was factual, quiet, and unmistakable, leaving them to face the consequences of their own decisions and their reliance on my compliance. And while I did not seek vengeance for its own sake, the satisfaction of seeing fairness established in the only way that mattered, through careful planning, evidence, and legal clarity, was profound. And when I finally closed the last file on my desk, I allowed myself to breathe, knowing that I had reclaimed control not through confrontation or rage, but through precision, patience, and the kind of quiet diligence that my family had underestimated for decades. And in that stillness, I realized that the house, the debts, and the expectations that had once felt like chains were now objects of observation rather than instruments of oppression, and I could, for the first time in years, measure my own freedom without apology.